Mr. Chomsky, we're talking there about American terror, and I think you make a very accurate observation that we are responsible for what we do, but hardly responsible for what other people do, except insofar as we are in a position to influence them.
That's right.
For instance, if there is a mass starvation in Biafra, even though we did not cause it, there is a sense in which we are responsible if we don't do something to attempt to alleviate it.
Right.
Now, by the same token, if we are prepared to agree that it is not always easy to taxonomize military action into that which is terroristic and that which is purely a military operation, we are left with doubts, for instance, about the bombing of Germany in 1942, 43, 44.
Mm-hmm.
You might contend that this was terroristic and unnecessary, and you might be right, although you're not a military expert, neither am I. But I
think there's a point to that.
Yeah, but I do judge that even if we all agree that what we did in Dresden was inexcusable, as a moral question, it's got to be understood in context of what was it that brought us to Dresden in the first instance.
Absolutely.
And what brought us to South Vietnam in the first instance, in my judgment, was clearly an uninterested, or I should say disinterested, concern for the stability and possibilities of a region of the world.
What period do you feel that we had this disinterested relationship to Vietnam?
Right now.
No, at what period did we have it? Did it begin? Let's say 1951, for example, when the State Department bulletin points out that we must help the French reconquer their former colony, and we must eradicate all Vietnamese resistance down to its last roots in order to reestablish the French in power. Was that disinterested?
To increase my vulnerability, I wish we had helped the French.
We did. We supported
but not
them.
Sufficiently. Not sufficiently.
Well, but
there's no point in helping somebody insufficiently.
It was hardly disinterested when we attempted, as you know, with tremendous support, in fact, to reinstate French imperialism in South Vietnam.
Now, it was disinterested in this sense, and I think this is an important distinction which you do touch on in your book. It's a disinterested act if my attempt to help, or your attempt to help a particular nation, is in order to spare you the possibility of a great ordeal in the future, which will harm you, your family, your children, your republic.
And in that sense, Nazi Germany was also disinterested.
Yeah,
after all, Nazi Germany was conquering Eastern Europe only in order to advance the values of Christian spiritual civilization and to restore the Slavs to their rightful home and so on and so forth. Totally disinterested.
Look, I follow you. I follow you. But if you want me to pursue that digression, I will.
Okay.
But let's suspend it for a moment. Okay. I'm distinguishing that kind of disinterestedness between the kind of...
but that's not a kind of disinterestedness. You see, that's something which includes as a special case every case of military aggression and colonialism in history. It's all disinterested in your sense.
Well, all right, let me simply rest my case by saying that there is an observable distinction by intelligent men between a country that reaches out and interferes with the affairs of another country because it has reason to believe that a failure to do so will result in universal misery, and that country which reaches out and interferes with another country because it wants to establish Coca-Cola plants there and chase national banks and whatever and exploit it. Now, that is an observable
It's a conceptual well, let's distinguish between a conceptual distinction and a factual
I'm prepared to do that.
All right, it is a conceptual distinction, but in actual fact, the history of colonialism shows that these two motivations can coincide. That is, practically every, I mean, there are exceptions, you know, probably the Belgians and the Congo are an exception, but by and large, the major imperialist ventures have been in the economic, in the material interest or in the perceived material interest.
I'm not interested in the mathematics of the,
let me finish.
You have already conceded that it's not merely a conceptual difference.
I say it is.
There are exceptions.
There are a few exceptions.
All right.
Like say
okay. But let's talk about the exceptions then.
Well, no, but the exceptions are at the difference. No, wait a minute. The exceptions. I mentioned, for example, the Belgians in the Congo. There, they didn't even pretend to have a civilizing mission. There, it was pure material self-interest. These are the exceptions. There are, as far as I know, no exceptions on the other side. There are. I mean, maybe I've left out a case of history, but as I see the history of colonialism, the great massive cases are cases where a powerful country was working in its perceived material self-interest and was covering what it was doing to itself and to the world with very pleasant phrases about preserving Christian values or helping the poor benighted natives or one thing or another. Now, there are a few exceptions where there was pure predatory imperialism. not even any pretense of doing anything, but these are quite rare.
But not
and
all
we're
that,
in the
not
mainstream
all
of
that
imperialism in
rare.
this sense.
The
Pure predatory imperialism, I think it's quite
sure,
rare, yeah.
the history of the Roman Empire.
Well, let's take one. I mean, since the Industrial Revolution.
Since the Industrial Revolution. Well,
You know,
if you say that people have refined the art of apologetics, I don't deny it. But it is also true, and I think manifestly true, that there have been interferences with the affairs of other nations whose purposes were, in my judgment, manifestly benign.
For example?
Or for instance, the Truman Doctrine.
Oh, I don't think that was manifestly benign at all. That was an attempt to
well, the Greeks
develop
an benign. I think the
Greek situation was benign, not at all. We were
I
trying
say
to
the Greeks' testimony is more interesting to me than yours.
Which Greek testimony?
The
testimony of the thousands of people who were thrown into jail and.
Well, I grant not the testimony of the Greek communists who were beaten.
Or the Greek peasants who were.
Well, there again, is it a conceptual difference that between the person who desires a life under some kind of freedom and one who desires life under some kind of under communism?
No, because there's no such opposition in Greece. There was a distinction between a very repressive regime which we instituted in 1946 and another regime, I don't know what it would have been, that would have grown out of a victory of the so-called communists. Now, if you see, what we did had nothing to do with freedom. What we instituted was
This is absolute historical romancing, I would say,
I don't
because
believe,
the number of people who were slaughtered in Greece, first by the communist insurgency, then by the Nazis, then again by the communists, add up to an enormous
communist insurgency before the Nazis? Which one?
Not insurgency, conquest.
Communist conquest before the Nazis in Greece?
Communist insurgency.
Prior to the Nazis in Greece?
Yes, the civil war of the early 40s.
My point is that
the Greeks...
your history is quite confused.
No, that's not bad at all. No, it isn't
there was no communist insurgency prior to the Nazis. There were communist resistance bands that fought against the Nazis.
This is a matter of nomenclature. The point is that the 40-year-old or the 45-year-old Greek has fought 3 times in certain ventures, in one of which they acknowledged that we bailed them out.
Who is they? Who is they? The rulers of Greece acknowledge that.
No, also the people.
Oh, I'm quite unaware of that. I'm quite unaware that the people of Greece have spoken on this issue.
Even Papandreou, you like him, I assume, because he hates us.
No, not at all. Not at all. George Papandreou was one of the people who was.
and I'm talking about Andrea, which makes it even.
Has Andreas Papandreou?
They're both on record as being grateful to President Truman for his intervention in that part of the world in 1947.
In that case, I disagree with him on that issue. I mean, I really do. I think we had no right to intervene in Greece in 1947.
No, now we're talking about rights,
and
which gets us away from the discussion.
All right, let's talk about whether we did it
whether or not there is such a thing as relatively disinterested international interference. And it seems to me that America's record is rather good. We went through an imperialist phase, but we pulled out of it faster than any country in the history of civilization.
I think we're very deep.
Why did we pull out of the Philippines, for instance?
We pulled out of the Philippines because it became a bad investment.
Why?
Because if you look, American agricultural interests were very much opposed to the, back in the mid-30s, they were very strongly opposed to the free trade relationships which allowed Philippine crops to compete with them. That's why we pulled out of the Philippines.
Why do these agricultural interests authorize us to intervene in South Vietnam?
They didn't.
If you consider this is...
Because we didn't intervene on the basis...
This is the critical dimension.
No, I say that in the Philippines it was the critical dimension. Look, the world is a complex place.
I'm aware of
There are certain interests that were involved
MIT is a complex place.
Well, there were certain interests that were involved in our Philippine venture. There are different interests that are involved in our Vietnam venture. You see, our Vietnam... Don't forget that with the Second World War, America's imperial interests expanded enormously. I mean, prior to the Second World War, we were sort of a marginal imperialist power, except for the Monroe Doctrine. But since the Second World War, we became the world's major imperialist power. And Vietnam is simply one piece of an attempt to construct a very large integrated world system, of which Greece was another piece.
Yeah, we became an imperial power, Mr. Chomsky, in the sense that we inherited primary responsibility for any chain of action that might involve us in a Third World War.
I don't believe
and something that might involve the entire world in Holocaust. And
no,
under the circumstances... well, I know you don't believe it, but
in fact, I think that
it might be refreshing to listen to this point of view, which is that there are people who do believe that America, unhappily and certainly not desiring it, inherited the responsibility for trying to abort international Holocaust, and has from time to time done so by such ventures as the Truman Doctrine, martial aid, and things like that.
No, I don't agree.
With martial aid not disinterested?
No, martial aid is quite different. First of all, martial...
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I interrupted you, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, first of all, you've now mentioned Marshall Aid for the first time, and Marshall Plan aid has to be distinguished quite sharply from the Truman Doctrine.
Why?
Why? Because the Truman Doctrine was a doctrine of military intervention, and the Marshall Plan was our first attempt at a major aid program.
You do understand that sometimes
a
a soldier can be as useful as a bushel of wheat, don't you?
Now look, nevertheless, if we're going to be at all clear about the American role, we're certainly going to distinguish between military intervention and economic intervention. They're very different in the way they function. Now, the fact of the matter is that neither was disinterested in your sense, I don't think, but they're very different in the impact that they had. The Truman Doctrine, I think, was a disastrous venture. I think the Marshall Plan was arguable.